Alessio Vercetti arrives like a storm wrapped in silk. His convoy slides to a halt in front of Sacred Heart Hospital, the immaculate, glass-walled monument his fortune built. Conversations die mid-sentence. Nurses pause. Security straightens. Alessio steps out in an immaculate suit, confidence stitched into every step. This place is supposed to prove he's more than the blood on his hands. His legacy, his redemption. He walks toward the entrance, already knowing the doors will open. They don't. A mop bucket squeaks across the tiles. A janitor, weathered face, steady eyes, steps into Alessio's path. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't tremble. Not you, he says quietly. You don't get to come in here. For a heartbeat, the world holds its breath. Alessio's men tense, hands hovering near hidden weapons. Alessio studies the man, this nobody, who dares to refuse him. But there is grief in the janitor's eyes, recognition, and a resolve born from someone who has already lost everything. A king without a crown, a servant who refuses to kneel. And for the first time in years, Alessio wonders whether all the power he owns means anything at all. If you're hooked, stay with me till the very end of the story. Don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe button, drop a comment, and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. I've got so many incredible stories coming your way, and you definitely don't want to miss any of them. Alright, let's get back to the story. Alessio Vercetti had never meant to become a legend. Legends were carved out of saints and martyrs, and he had been neither. Yet in this city, his name moved like weather, spoken in lowered voices, felt in the tightening of shoulders, carried in rumors the way a storm carries thunder. He owned restaurants that never closed, nightclubs where lights never slept, construction companies that built half the skyline. His money seeped into everything. Businesses, politics, the quiet corners of law. Respect followed him, or something that looked enough like respect. He no longer bothered to tell the difference. He learned early that fear traveled faster than trust. But age has a way of leaning on a man. The successes that once tasted like victory began to taste like metal. He stopped sleeping through the night. He stopped pretending he didn't remember names. The ones from ledger books. Yes, but also from morgues, from whispered condolences, from broken mothers clutching photographs. So when the plans for Sacred Heart Hospital crossed his desk, Alessio didn't hesitate. A state-of-the-art facility. Private wings. Research labs. A chapel. A monument of glass and white stone that would catch the sun and scatter forgiveness across the city skyline. He would fund it all. Quietly, of course. Or so the papers would claim. People called it philanthropy. Some said penance. Alessio called it balance. If the scales were already dripping red, then he would stack hospitals and scholarships and charity foundations until the weight evened out. He told himself that healing was healing, regardless of where the money came from. He told himself that every life saved whispered his absolution. And yet, the more the hospital rose out of the earth, the less he visited the construction site. He preferred to see it finished, polished, anonymous. He imagined walking those halls someday not as a king inspecting his territory, but as a man among men. One who had built something good. Something no bullet, no debt, no blood could stain. His empire admired the move. Politicians called him visionary. Reporters rewrote his myths. Even rivals nodded in grim respect. The city spoke his name differently now, less with fear, more with wary gratitude. He wore that change like a new suit. But when the opening came and the cameras flashed, Alessio stayed away. Redemption, he believed, was like mourning. It demanded privacy. He visited later, without press, without ceremony. The automatic doors parted like confession. He thought he understood power. He thought he'd purchased a place of light to balance the dark. He thought, foolishly, that redemption could be built in glass and stone and paid for in wire transfers. It wasn't until the day a janitor stepped into his path that Alessio realized something terrible and undeniable. You cannot buy your way back to being human. The first time Dario Bruni saw Alessio Vercetti in person, he didn't see the legend. He saw the weight. The way the man carried silence with him, as if noise itself was afraid to linger. Dario had heard the stories, of course, everyone had. He'd mopped around the aftermath of those stories more often than he cared to remember. But standing at the hospital entrance that morning, watching the sleek convoy roll to a stop, he felt something quieter than fear. Something heavier. A decision already made. He didn't plan a speech. He didn't rehearse courage in the mirror. Courage, he'd learned, wasn't loud. It was a single heartbeat refusing to retreat. The doors were supposed to slide open for Alessio. They always did, for men like him. Instead, they parted just enough to reveal Dario standing there, mop handle resting lightly against his shoulder, the faint smell of disinfectant rising like incense. He could feel the security guards stiffen behind him. He could feel the bodyguard's eyes sharpen. But he kept his gaze steady on the man approaching with the air of someone who had never been denied entry in his life. "Good morning," Dario said softly. Alessio nodded, expecting passage. Dario did not move. It was a small thing, really. The absence of motion. But it rippled outward like a dropped stone in still water. "I'm going inside," Alessio said, his voice even, polite, and dangerous. Dario shook his head once. Not today. It could have ended there, with laughter, with mockery, with violence. Instead, Alessio paused. The world shrank to two men and a line no one could see. "You know who I am," Alessio said. "Yes," Dario replied. And yet, he echoed, with a hint of grief. "This place is for healing." The words weren't shouted. They weren't dramatic. They were simply true. Dario spoke to them the way he cleaned floors, carefully, deliberately, with respect for what the space was meant to be. A bodyguard shifted, the scrape of leather whispering threat. Dario didn't even glance his way. There was nothing left to take from him that hadn't already been taken. That was his armor. That was the terrible freedom Alessio saw in his eyes. Not defiance, not bravado, but a man who had already lived through the worst day of his life. "I don't hate you," Dario added. "But you don't get to walk through these doors and pretend this is yours. Not after what it cost." For a moment, Alessio looked past him, into the lobby, the polished floors, the faint echo of footsteps, the quiet mercy of medicine. He saw a world where pain was met with care, not contracts. He saw the boundary Dario was guarding, and for the first time he wondered whether the hospital had ever belonged to him at all. No one breathed. No one spoke. And in that stillness, Alessio understood the danger before him wasn't the janitor. It was the truth. For a while, neither of them spoke. The world tilted around them, engines humming, footsteps echoing somewhere deep inside the hospital. But the silence between the two men felt heavier than sound. Alessio's gaze lingered on the janitor's face, searching for the familiar flicker of fear he'd grown used to. Instead, he found something quieter. Not hatred, not anger, recognition. "You think this is a game of principle," Alessio said, his voice low. "A gesture, but you don't know me." Dario gave the faintest hint of a bitter smile. "I know enough." He rested a hand lightly on the mop, as if it anchored him to the floor. His eyes drifted past Alessio for a second, staring at a place only memory could reach. "It was 3 years ago," he said softly. "Late. Too late for anyone decent to be knocking on doors." Alessio didn't reply. He didn't need to. He had heard this opening line before, too many times. "They'd come for my neighbor," Dario continued. "Wrong crowd. Wrong debt. Same story everyone hears until it's theirs." He swallowed, but his voice didn't shake. "My boy was 17. Thought he could help. Though if he said the right words, things would calm down. He had that kind of heart. Always rushing toward trouble with open hands." His fingers tightened around the mop handle. There were raised voices. A scuffle. Someone panicked. Someone pulled something they never should have carried. His words remained clean, careful. He refused to turn grief into spectacle. "By the time I reached the street, the lights from your men's car were already disappearing. And my son," he didn't finish the sentence. Some truths don't need language. A hush settled over the entrance. Even the bodyguards seemed to breathe differently. "They told me it wasn't personal," Dario said. As if that helped. As if changing the category of pain made it smaller. He looked back at Alessio now, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I came to this hospital because I couldn't fix what had happened. But I could mop blood from the floors. I could clean rooms so someone else's child had a chance. I thought maybe, in a place like this, there was still something worth protecting. Alessio's jaw tensed, the line of his mouth thinning into something unreadable. He had trained himself to forget faces, to step over grief like puddles after rain. Yet here it stood, breathing the same air. I don't stop you because I want revenge, Dario said quietly. Revenge changes nothing. I stop you because this is the one place you don't get to claim. Not with money. Not with names. Suffering already lives here. It doesn't need its author walking the halls. He exhaled, as though he'd set down a burden he'd carried too long. So yes, he finished. I know who you are. And for the first time, Alessio wondered whether the hospital's gleaming walls were less a monument to his goodness, and more a mirror he'd been trying not to look into. The wind brushed cold across Alessio's face as the automatic doors stayed shut, holding him outside like an unworthy pilgrim barred from a sanctuary. He didn't argue. Not yet. Instead, he let Dario's words lodge in him, sharp and unyielding, the way broken glass embeds in skin. There was a time he would have brushed it off, called it collateral, misfortune, a tragedy of circumstance. Words that turned real people into numbers on a ledger. Now the words tasted bitter. He had learned early that power was a crown you didn't so much wear as grow around your bones. It bent your spine. It taught you to walk differently. Every decision he made felt like a jewel pressed into metal, heavier and harder to remove. Somewhere along the way, the crown had fused to him. He had forgotten what it felt like to lift his head without effort. So he built hospitals, schools, shelters. He wrote checks with more zeros than he ever kept for himself, and the world nodded in approval. Philanthropy, they called it. Redemption, some whispered, as though money could polish rusted metal and make it gleam like something new. But Alessio knew better than anyone that guilt was clever. It didn't arrive screaming. It wrapped itself in purpose. It told you that doing good today excused what happened yesterday. That if you saved enough lives, the scales might tilt, and fate might look at you differently. The hospital had been his grand gesture. Clean lines, sunlit corridors, doctors with soft voices and steady hands. He wanted it to be a place untouched by the smoky backrooms and whispered threats that had built his fortune. He wanted to believe he could craft one immaculate thing and place it in the world like an offering. Yet here stood a man with a mop and a memory that refused to be bought. Dario's story replayed in Alessio's mind, but it was not the first time he had seen the aftermath of decisions he had never quite claimed. He remembered the news clippings, the quiet funerals, the way his associates spoke of casualties like misfiled documents. He nodded. He had carried on. Then, when the nights grew too loud, he had written another check. He wondered, now, if the hospital walls absorbed it all, the unspoken apologies threaded through every polished tile. If the building itself sagged a little under the weight of the truth no one was naming. For a fleeting moment, Alessio wanted to rip the crown from his head, to feel his neck unburdened. But crowns are not removed so easily. They cling. They remind me. And there he stood, an emperor of regrets, staring at the very monument he'd built to quiet them. Perhaps, he thought, Dario wasn't guarding the hospital from him. Perhaps he was guarding Alessio from the terrible possibility that none of it, none of the charity, the ribbon cuttings, the glowing headlines, had ever been redemption at all. The hospital seemed to lean in, as if the walls themselves had ears. Word traveled quickly in places where lives paused and waited. Voices moved along corridors like quiet tides. A few nurses slowed at the far end of the hallway, their shoes whispering against the polished floor. They did not cluster or gossip. They simply watched, unwilling to disturb the fragile gravity between the two men at the entrance. A young resident stood beside the vending machine, fingers poised over a row of buttons he had forgotten how to read. He had grown up hearing the name Alessio spoken with an uneasy kind of gratitude, the benefactor no one quite wanted to thank out loud. He had studied medicine because he believed he could fix things. Yet here he was, realizing some wounds did not lie under skin. Near the reception desk, an elderly woman waited with a paper cup of tea cooling in her hands. Her husband slept upstairs beneath a tangle of 4 lines and hushed encouragement. She had donated to this hospital once, smiling at a polished brochure that promised hope. Now she looked at the man who had funded it all and felt something like pity soften beneath her ribs. Power didn't make him tall in that doorway. Regret did. A security guard shifted his weight, torn between duty and the unspoken understanding that this moment required stillness rather than muscle. He knew Dario, had exchanged small jokes with him while the man mopped late-night floors, both of them sharing the quiet companionship of people who worked while the world slept. Seeing him stand firm now, calm and immovable, the guard felt a stirring he didn't name. Respect, maybe, or the recognition of someone deciding not to shrink anymore. Upstairs, a teenage girl with a bandaged wrist glanced through the railing of the mezzanine. She watched Alessio's shoulders, the way they carried something she could not see but somehow recognized. She wondered how many choices it took before a person forgot the shape of who they had been. Even the children seemed subdued. A boy with plastic dinosaurs lined along the arm of his wheelchair stared toward the glass doors, sensing the shift in the air. His mother rested a hand on his hair, unsure whether to pull him away or let him witness what dignity looked like when it didn't need to shout. The hospital breathed as one, not judging, simply remembering that every person who crossed its threshold brought their ghosts with them. Some came seeking healing. Some came hiding from consequence. And sometimes, like now, both arrived in the same skin. Alessio felt their eyes without turning. Dario did too, but he didn't falter. The mop rested at his side like a staff, ordinary and sacred at once. Around them, life continued. Monitors beeped, doors opened, grief and hope brushed shoulders in the corridors. But for a brief, suspended moment, the entire building seemed to watch and ask a single, silent question. What does it truly mean to be allowed inside? Alessio's eyes narrowed, and for the first time since stepping out of his convoy, he moved closer, each step measured, deliberate, the echo of polished shoes on tile like a drumbeat of authority. The hospital seemed to shrink around him, walls bending with expectation, yet Dario stood unmoved, mop in hand, feet planted like roots sunk deep into conscience. Alessio's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. He had spent a lifetime bending people with words, with fear, with wealth. He was practiced, skilled, inevitable. Name your price, he said finally, voice smooth, almost gentle. Anything you want. A house. A sum of money that could change your life. A position here. Anything. You have only to ask. His hands lifted slightly, not in threat, but in demonstration. Wealth was his language, and he expected it to be understood. I give. You take. Everyone has a price, Dario. Dario shook his head, slowly, deliberately. I don't. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of years spent holding on to what mattered. Nothing you offer changes the past. Nothing you give me can bring back the life you took. Alessio felt the cold edge of frustration nibble at the corners of his composure. Money had always been the solvent, the lubricant that allowed him to move through the world without sticking. Now it felt useless, a weight in his hands. He tried again. Think carefully. This isn't personal. You could walk away with everything you've ever needed. Do you really want to stand here like this? Dario's gaze did not waver. His eyes held memory and pain and a kind of quiet, unshakable resolve. I don't want what can't be earned honestly, he said. I don't want favors. I don't want to be bought. And I don't want you in this place. Alessio's jaw tightened. He could feel the air grow heavier between them, charged with something older than fear or power. It was principle, an invisible force stronger than the money stacked in his accounts. For the first time, he realized he could offer everything he owned, everything he had spent decades building, and it would still be meaningless here. Dario's refusal was not loud. It was not violent. It was complete, final. And in that finality, Alessio felt a stir of something unfamiliar, recognition, perhaps, of the truth that had long eluded him. That some debts cannot be paid with coins, that some doors will never open for the man who built them with blood. For a heartbeat, Alessio considered what it meant to surrender. For a heartbeat, Dario stood like a monument, unmoved and unbought, guarding not just the hospital, but the fragile, enduring notion that some things are beyond price. Alessio's hand hovered, the faint twitch of a finger enough to make the bodyguards tense, muscles coiled like spring-loaded steel. The world seemed to contract, compressing the corridor into a narrow tube of anticipation. Every step he had taken, every calculated move, had led to this fragile, suspended instant. One signal from him, and Dario Bruni would fall, lifeless. Another name folded into the ledger of consequences Alessio had long tried to ignore. Dario did not flinch. Not his eyes, not his stance, not the faint grip on the mop handle. It was a stillness born not of ignorance, but of absolute certainty. He had stared down death before, had held the pieces of his family in memory while the world told him to move on. Now death waited just beyond the reach of a finger, and he remained unmoved. Alessio's chest tightened, the weight of the crown he had worn all his life pressing down harder than ever. He had executed orders without hesitation. He had watched men fall for debts, for mistakes, for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Violence was the language he understood, the instrument of his empire, and yet here it was, whispering in his ear like a lover he no longer trusted. The bodyguards shifted, small movements carrying the promise of action. They were trained to obey, to act before hesitation could take root. Alessio felt the tension coil in the space between him and Dario like a live wire. One signal, one blink, one imperceptible nod, and it would be done. But the choice gnawed at him in a way that threats never had. Dario's eyes met his, steady and unwavering. There was no challenge there, only truth. The truth of every life that had been lost under Alessio's command. The truth of all the nights spent trying to sleep with ghosts pressing against the walls. The truth of a man who had built a hospital to hide from the monster he had become. And in that frozen moment, Alessio felt it, the impossible weight of his own hands. Power was meaningless here. Money was meaningless here. Fear was meaningless here. Only one thing mattered, and it terrified him more than any bullet ever could: conscience. He could kill the man in front of him and maintain the illusion of control. He could enforce obedience and silence the conscience that had whispered too long. But to do so would be to see every life he had touched through violence mirrored back in Dario's unyielding gaze. The corridor seemed to hold its breath. The hospital itself waited. Alessio's fingers twitched once, twice, and then, slowly, impossibly, he lowered his hand. The signal never came. Dario did not move. For the first time in decades, Alessio realized that surrender was not weakness. It was recognition. And recognition, though heavy, carried the faintest flicker of something he had long forgotten: humanity. Alessio stepped back, the weight of the crown he had worn all his life pressing against his temples, bending him with the invisible force of guilt and regret. The hand that had hovered above Dario, poised to command death, now hung useless at his side. He looked at the janitor, at the steady eyes, at the man who had taken nothing but a stance and had offered everything Alessio had longed for: honesty. For the first time in years, Alessio felt the raw, unguarded pulse of his own inadequacy, of all the lives he had touched and broken, and all the illusions he had spun to keep himself comfortable. The bodyguards froze, their muscles taut, waiting for orders that would never come. Alessio did not give them one. He did not need to. The authority he had cultivated like armor suddenly felt brittle, irrelevant, meaningless. The world that had bent to his wealth and fear seemed to tilt on its axis, leaving him standing in the quiet center of something larger than power. He saw it then, clearly, with the terrible clarity only comes to men who have faced themselves in unflinching light. The hospital, the polished floors, the sunlight streaming across the lobby, it had never belonged to him. It belonged to the people who walked its corridors, to the hands that healed, the eyes that saw suffering, and to the janitor who had taken a simple, immovable stance against a life built on violence. Alessio's reflection flickered in the glass doors. Not the feared boss, not the benefactor, not the man who had imagined redemption could be bought. Only himself. A man who had lived by fear, who had traded morality for power, who had justified blood with contracts and coin. And now, In the unflinching gaze of Dario, he saw the possibility of something else. "I don't belong here," he said, his voice low, stripped of pretense, of negotiation, of command. "You're right." The words trembled as they left him. They were not performative. They carried no promise of change. They carried only acknowledgement, the first honest thing he had spoken in decades. Dario did not smile. He did not nod. He simply stepped aside, letting Alessio retreat, letting the man who had built empires understand the quiet weight of humility. Alessio took a slow breath, the corridors of the hospital alive with life around him. For the first time, he saw not an empire of obedience, but a reflection of himself, flawed, human, and, for the first time, aware that true power might not lie in dominion at all. He turned and walked away. The crown, heavy and invisible, seemed to lift slightly from his shoulders, leaving a man who had finally begun to look at himself without pretense. Alessio walked back to his car in silence. The sounds of the hospital, distant monitors, the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes, a child's cough from upstairs, threading around him like a faint pulse he could almost feel but not quite touch. The world had not changed. The city outside still churned with the same violence, the same debts, the same quiet compromises. The empire he had built waited for him, indifferent to the subtle tremor in his conscience. Yet something inside him had shifted, though he could not name it fully. Dario returned to his mop, moving with the same deliberate care he always had, rinsing the dirt and dust from the tiles as if it could somehow absorb the weight of what had transpired. The staff and patients, who had lingered in the lobby, drifted back into their routines, whispers fading into a low hum. Some watched him, some looked away, and some pretended they had seen nothing at all. Life resumed, not perfectly, not erased, but carrying forward, resilient in its quiet insistence. Alessio did not make a show of change. He did not call the press, nor did he announce donations, apologies, or gestures of penance. Redemption, he now understood, was not a headline. It was small, private, almost imperceptible. A visit to a grave in silence. A quietly signed check to families who would never know the giver. A moment of restraint when violence might have been easier. He drove through the city, the skyline stretching before him like a mirror of the life he had led, some shining with light, some darkened by shadows. For the first time in decades, he noticed the faces in the streets. A mother carrying groceries, a boy running to catch a bus, a man who looked tired in his own skin. He imagined the lives he had touched and harmed, and instead of turning away, he allowed himself to feel it. The weight of responsibility, the sharp edges of regret, the faint flicker of possibility. Alessio did not know if he would ever be forgiven. He did not know if he could ever forgive himself. But he understood something he had never understood before, that even the smallest choice, when made honestly, could matter. That even a man like him could begin to walk a different path, if only he walked it quietly, without fanfare, without claim. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Dario's unwavering gaze lingered, not as a threat, not as judgment, but as a mirror, one that reflected the man Alessio could become, if he chose it. And for the first time, Alessio wanted to choose. Not for applause, not for legacy, not for absolution, but simply to try. The road ahead was long, uncertain, and unmarked. But he took the first step.